Level 989.
Welcome to 989 on Health, where you don't need years of university to understand the latest news about health and related subjects. We've created a list of helpful links on today's topic at our website, level989.com, and you can also find those links in the podcast playing app you're using right now.
This informal discussion shares our personal views. Don't rely on this podcast as an alternative to medical advice from a professional healthcare provider. For the full disclaimer, please see our website.
I'm Mike Davalos, just an average Joe, and I'm joined by the opposite of average, Brandon Weintraub, a primary care physician. Good evening, Mr. Brandon.
Good evening, Mike. I have to admit, I'm excited about today's episode and our guest.
I'm excited too. Our guest today is my oldest friend. I've known her, almost 20 years. We met in 1999, I believe. And she's my wife's best friend since high school. We've been roommates. We even worked together for a while back in California. Welcome, Liz. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Good evening, guys. Great to talk to you again, Mike, and great to meet you, Brandon. Wow, thanks for reminding me. It's been almost 20 years, Mike. I needed that age reminder right before my birthday. Anyways, a little bit about me. I'm Liz Rubino. I'm a full-time manager of a large IT team, an NYU alumni, a full-time Siberian Husky and Calico cat mom, a part-time baker, and I collect vinyl, Star Wars Lego sets, and cake recipes.
Very cool. Our topics for today are addiction and recovery. As always, I'll be providing the average Joe angle, and Brandon will be here to offer his usual skepticism and medical expertise. And Liz, can you explain your experience or angle for today's episode?
I'm glad you asked, because otherwise it'd be strange to be here. Aside from all the other things I mentioned, I'm also a regional advocate for the National Council of Alcohol and Drug Dependence, a recovery coach, a certified peer recovery specialist, and drumroll, a person living in long-term recovery from drugs and alcohol for over 11 years.
I think most people's first thought, if you were to tell them, I'm an addict, would be the person's addicted to drugs. And these days, the number one addiction is, well, surprise, it's complicated. It depends. There are a series of tiers breaking down age groups, substances, and behaviors.
Hey, it depends is my line. Also, you might be jumping ahead here. Just a bit.
Oh, I know. In trying to research for this episode, I quickly realized I knew absolutely nothing about addiction. While culture and society, let's face it, mostly TV and movies, have given me one idea, my off-the-cuff concepts about addiction were just plain wrong. And not just a little wrong, I mean totally clueless wrong. Brandon, can you define for us, as clearly as possible, what is addiction? Actually, most of the snooty websites call it substance abuse disorder or substance dependence, right? But that's confusing. I could be addicted to gambling or addicted to binging old episodes of Murder, She Wrote. Those are not substances.
You're absolutely right that addiction really isn't limited to drugs. There are substance addictions and behavioral addictions. But before we continue, we need to establish a tight focus for today's episode. We've got a lot of fascinating and important stuff to discuss, so we need to rein ourselves in right from the start. Addiction in general is an ephemeral concept. As your references to gambling and television indicate, for today's episode, we're concentrating specifically on substance dependence as it relates to drugs.
Good. That'll help narrow down my questions. I did have some pretty great Jessica Fletcher jokes, all prepared, but that's fine. So, what about my question? What is addiction, and how would I know if I were addicted? Is there some kind of handy questionnaire?
For my part, I'll be trying to distill my own answers as well, and while I'd love to talk about all the complementary ideas and publications regarding the roots of addiction, we'd be recording for the next 6 hours. For most of my answers, to start with at least, I'll be focusing on how the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and the National Institute on Drug Abuse define substance use disorders, since these are the standards by which most medical professionals gauge and define addiction. There's still a couple of problems, the first of which is the breadth and depth of knowledge which is required for someone to try and quantify addiction. The current DSM utilizes 11 separate criteria to determine the severity of a patient's substance use disorder. Someone that fits into at least 2 of the 11 criteria over a 12-month period can be considered to have a clinically significant substance use issue. If you're interested in reading the list of criteria, there'll be a link in the show notes.
I'm glad you brought up the DSM, Brandon, which really is the sort of Bible of psychiatry, because with the recent changes in the 5th edition of the DSM, it's an exciting time to be talking about addiction and recovery. For the first time, people in the field are recognizing substance use disorders with degrees of severity in the same way there is a spectrum for autism as a comparison. This is extremely important for those trying to change the stigma surrounding addiction because it solves the riddle that people always pose to an addict, which is, why can't you just stop? Especially when the people asking the question have evidence of some person in their life just stopping. The updated DSM is also forcing people to look at individuals and their overall situations, instead of just labeling them as an addict. The previous edition of the DSM treated substance abuse in a very black and white way by defining substance abuse and substance dependence. You were either one or the other, and no one could say when or why you would cross from one to the other. Being on a spectrum of severity allows people to move from one level to another and explains a lot of the willpower stories we hear along with the unfortunate relapse stories.
Just to get this rolling in a way that's relatable to the average person, I just read over those criteria you pointed us to, and depending on how strictly you held me to those definitions, you might say I have a substance abuse disorder with caffeine. I'm a motivated person, but I tend to have a very low natural energy level, and I need a gentle boost to get moving and keep moving. I think a lot of folks would admit to being addicted to caffeine. Forget whether or not something's illegal, just consider its impact on the body. I mean, overdoses using caffeine are rare, but it does happen.
In fact, until the most recent version of the DSM, caffeine wasn't a substance that was given its own official disorder criteria. Caffeine is the most commonly used drug in the world, and its misuse affects more people than you might think. I'm most concerned about the idea that overdose on caffeine isn't particularly common. According to an NDC report, more than 5,000 cases of people who got sick from energy drinks were reported to U.S. poison control centers, and that's in a 3-year period. And those were only the cases that were reported. Please keep in mind, just because someone hasn't been hospitalized due to the negative effects of the substance, doesn't mean that there isn't the possibility that they are addicted to it, or that there isn't still a significant risk to their health.
Hey, no argument for me. I'm clearly underestimating the seriousness to consider caffeine a normal, harmless, everyday addiction. For a long while, I was taking multiple caffeine pills every day on top of any coffee or tea I had. I'm off the pills now, but if I don't have any caffeine on a given day, I'll be grumpy, I'll have a headache, but I won't have any shakes, shivers, or seizures if I don't get my daily dose. I won't be tempted to steal my neighbor's laptop to pay for my next pound of coffee. That'd be like running out of cigarettes, right? Not that I smoke. That stuff will kill you.
I am thankful that you're playing the part of devil's advocate, but in actuality, this viewpoint is one of the most common and most worrisome when discussing addiction. It seems like a slippery slope, like saying that as long as you aren't committing a felony, the addiction can't be that bad. What do you think, Liz? How prevalent or harmful is this sort of thinking in the people you've worked with?
Well, I'm glad you asked, because most people don't. It's extremely harmful to think that way, and a bit close-minded, I might add. Not only is it harmful to say as long as you aren't committing a felony, the addiction can't be that bad, but it's just as harmful to say the physical withdrawals aren't serious enough for the addiction to be that bad. I could probably go on for a few hours about how media, politics, and religion have shaped the way we view people addicted to substances, but we simply don't have time for that. So I'll try to summarize here. The first point I'd like to touch on is that addiction is a mental disorder and has been established as such for decades. In spite of anyone's personal beliefs or opinions, there's a ton of scientific evidence and academic writing to support this. So to determine the level of one's illness by their likelihood of passing a background check is clearly an insane way to measure, and it's not a way that we would measure any other illness on the planet. That would be as silly as a person diagnosed with depression saying, "I've only thought about killing myself once today. I must not be that depressed." People that only drink on occasion can get a DUI just like an alcoholic. One does not define the other. The second point I'd like to make is that not all substances have the same level of physical withdrawal symptoms, but it doesn't make them any less dangerous or less addictive. Opioids and alcohol are the only drug types that are considered physically addictive in such a way that medical detox would be necessary, because the withdrawal symptoms are dangerous and can lead to death if not properly handled. Does this mean that someone that smokes crack cocaine daily for decades is less of an addict? Does that mean that a heroin addict is worse than a crack addict? The stigma that those two misguided beliefs, along with many others, have created impact every person I deal with who's looking for help. From doctors to the court system to the jail system to simply seeking employment, we have set up a system against recovery for those with substance use disorders.
Okay, what you two are saying makes sense, but I'm older than y'all, and I remember the war on drugs, which started in 1971, in fact, the year I was born. The war on drugs seems to be all about getting the criminals dealing illegal drugs, and their customers too, off the streets and into prisons, where they can't hurt us kind, gentle members of society. The actions of governments, opportunistic corporations, and doctors have done a lot to make recovering from addiction much more difficult. There's a lot of blame to be placed, but I think our time in this episode is better spent exploring addiction and explaining some options for people who might be looking for a way out of a difficult cycle. Now, I'm no social scientist, but it seems like we've put a lot of folks in jail without doing much to fix the problem. And I'm not talking about drug dealing as an industry being the problem. These are people who are providing goods and services to fill a demand. That's just money. If there was no demand, the industry would evaporate. So do we even know what the problem is? How addiction works from the biological angle? In the brain and in the body?
The precise mechanisms of addiction aren't completely understood, no. As with most aspects of human biology, there are too many contributing factors to formulate a complete picture. In general, addiction is considered primarily an issue of neurological disruption. The substance being taken activates the brain's reward system.
Reward system? So the brain gives out gold stars whenever you do well in class? Is that it?
That isn't a bad analogy. In order to reinforce behaviors that are considered good or needed, like reproduction, for example, the body produces certain neurochemicals that can lead a person to feel happy or energetic or, in essence, good. When a teacher praises a student by giving them a gold star, that praise can activate the brain's reward system, giving them a feeling of accomplishment, happiness, and self-worth, which may well lead the student to trying harder in the future. Drugs, whether prescribed or illicit, can mimic these neurotransmitters or activate and utilize the processes that generate and receive them, in essence hijacking the reward system. The mechanism of action is different depending on the drug itself, but the end result is often a sense of euphoria of some variety and intensity. The problem is that drugs will, especially over time, degrade the processes that allow neurological signals to transmit, meaning higher concentrations of chemicals may well be needed. And since some drugs can cause a reward reaction 2 to 10 times more powerful than those that would be found naturally, a person can all too easily find themselves craving, even needing, their addictive substance of choice to even reach a state where they feel normal.
The gold star analogy was great, and everything Brandon said is so relatable for me as someone who was fortunate enough to live through the experience of being addicted to drugs and alcohol. In my experience, becoming addicted has a lot of factors outside of biology that reinforce the need to continue to do more and receive that gold star. But I'll get to that in a minute. I want to briefly point out how mind-blowing and important it is to find out that an actual hijacking of the reward system in my brain had taken place, and that as my neurotransmitters were being altered by drug use, which was innocent and experimental at first, what originally was characterized as a want to feel good by my brain had now been recategorized as a need for my brain to survive. That is crucial for people to understand when they talk about people with substance use disorders having a moral deficiency or a lack of willpower. At some point, your brain just doesn't work the same as everyone else's anymore when you become addicted. Many people don't realize how important that piece of information is to someone that wants help. Think about it. If you've been raised in the time where the country is at war with drugs, and you went through the DARE program in school, it has been drilled into your head that drugs are bad for you, and like everyone else, you don't even know why you can't stop. You just know you can't. Finding out that your brain is reprogrammed and you need some level of rehabilitation to train your brain to think differently is life-saving to someone in complete despair. It means there is hope, and hope is a very powerful thing for a drug addict. All that being said, one could and often does use the defense of not everyone that experiments with drugs gets a reprogrammed brain and becomes an addict. I'd like to hear Brandon's explanation before I give my 2 cents on it.
Unfortunately, there's an ongoing focus purely on the neurochemical aspects of addiction, the flood of dopamine, for example, as being primary in creating that cycle of addiction. I think it's important to mention that there are other factors that play a role in whether using a drug leads to an addiction. Not everyone who smokes a cigarette becomes a chain smoker. Not everyone who enjoys the occasional cocktail ends up an alcoholic. It isn't only physiological. Even something as seemingly innocuous as having a group of friends that regularly includes a type of drug in their activities can affect someone's chances of forming an addiction.
That's what I was getting at. There are so many factors that play into addiction that are far beyond biology. This is a disorder that impacts every race, all genders, all sexualities, in every religion. So it's hard to narrow down commonalities for those that become addicted and those that don't. This is another reason that individuals must be evaluated and treated as such because every story is different. One of my jobs is being on call in an emergency room of the local hospital near my town to respond to overdose reversals and substance use patients that end up there as a result of their misuse of drugs. Every patient I see is different and comes from a different place. Not all of them need detox or rehab. Not all of them are unemployed or homeless. Not all of them have a child endangered at home. There is no one-size-fits-all solution to this disorder. People are at different levels on the spectrum, and while some can be successful going to an intensive outpatient program or a 12-step fellowship, others need intensive, long-term inpatient therapy that may include trauma therapy for experiences they've had during their active using.
That sounds slightly familiar now that you lay it out. We spent some time in our episode about alcohol, discussing the genetics that play into alcohol's variable effect in our bodies, how diet, exercise, and stress can influence a person's likelihood to become addicted. But we didn't look at the social or psychological aspects of addiction in that episode. During my research for this episode, I read something that kind of put things into an interesting perspective. Brandon, what can you tell us about something called Rat Park?
You know, you're not making it easy for me to keep my responses short. Okay, Rat Park. In the 1970s, Canadian psychologist Bruce Alexander began to question the results of previous addiction studies performed on rats. In these studies, rats were taken from their natural environments and placed, individually, into small enclosures. The rats were then hooked up to a system which intravenously delivered, almost instantaneously, a dose of an opioid whenever they pushed a lever. Professor Alexander had an interesting theory, that it wasn't the physiological or chemical function of the drugs that caused addiction, but instead a psychosocial need developed as a result of the abnormal living conditions created by the experiments themselves.
I've never known the name of the professor, but I've heard his work referenced a lot over the years. How animals are weak-willed. If you give them a happy juice button, they'll just keep pushing it until they die of thirst. But please, go on. How did this theory lead to Rat Park?
In order to test his theory, Professor Alexander developed a new experimental method. He created a controlled living environment for one set of rats, which better mimicked a natural living environment. Things to climb on, room to move, a group which included both males and females. Essentially a park for rats. These rats were given access to opioids, and their consumption of these opioids were compared to the intake of opioids of rats in another group, rats which were kept in the solitary confinement, and whose living conditions much more closely matched those found in the average laboratory testing. The results seemed to indicate that the rats living in Rat Park consumed significantly less opioid than the rats in the other group. The reproducibility of the results of this study have been both confirmed and questioned since the study's publication in 1981. But regardless, Rat Park was one of the first attempts to include factors besides the neurological to the explanation of addiction.
The Rat Park experiment gave great insight into how addiction can be treated, or at least demonstrated how drugs could be made less appealing. It's easy to see that when the rats had lots of social interaction, things to do, and a fulfilling life, they were simply not as interested in numbing themselves. You could say we have our own Rat Park experiment going on with the jail system in the US. Isolation and criminalization does not decrease the use of substances in humans any more than it did with the rats. Yet, that's where we send people to rehabilitate them. What does work is therapy, employment assistance, and social interaction, among other things, which vary in level of need from person to person, as I mentioned before, and reintroduce people with substance use disorders back into society. Give their lives value and provide that social connection, just like the rats in Rat Park.
One of the terms I've heard a lot in relation to drug use, more while I was growing up than in the past few years, was something called gateway drugs. These are minor drugs that might lead you to more potent ones that would have more severe effects. For example, maybe my love of caffeine might lead to an Adderall addiction, or even stronger amphetamines after that. So are gateway drugs a real thing? Or is it just some kind of scary turn of phrase for governments and social welfare groups to try to frighten us away from some totally harmless experimentation.
I won't go quite as far as to say that gateway drug is nothing more than a scary turn of phrase, but it also isn't quite as clear-cut as some of the things we were taught might have made it seem. There have been a veritable ton of studies trying to determine just how accurate the idea of a gateway drug is. Alcohol, according to studies, seems to have the strongest statistical association, meaning that, once again, one of the most socially acceptable drugs is also one of the most potentially dangerous. Depending on the drug, the age of the user, their emotional state, the possibility of one drug being directly linked to increased likelihood of trying another drug seems to be extremely variable.
Ah, the good old gateway drug topic. Personally, I can't tell you if one drug is more of a gateway than the other, because some drugs were simply not made available to me until much later. I would agree with the studies that alcohol tends to be the main offender, but it is also legal, easy to obtain, and readily accessible in most households. The funny part that I've noticed that no one seems to consider when discussing a term like gateway drug is that most people who are addicted to substances will point to a specific preference or drug of choice in their story. Some people just went to bars and occasionally smoked weed like normal people until they were introduced to cocaine at a party. Other people were just taking pills to deal with pain management, and then when those got too expensive or their prescription ended and they found themselves getting sick, they found heroin. Typically, an addict that points to a drug of choice uses it as a tipping point to when their life started to really spin out of control. If you ask me, that's the real gateway drug, and it varies from person to person. For some people, that drug is alcohol, and that's enough for them. For others, it has to go much farther.
Okay, so now I think we have a better idea of what addiction is and some of the contributing factors. I think it's time to look at the modern approach to fighting addiction. What's the current standard treatment for, say, an opioid addiction? According to the American Society of Addiction Medicine, in 2015, more than 2 million people were addicted to prescription painkillers, and almost 600,000 were addicted to heroin. So if I were to be treated for an opioid addiction, let's say I'm addicted to phenytoin, and maybe in this scenario I had, say, a car accident. I was in a lot of pain for many months, and I'm all healed up now, but I'm also hooked on the drug. I read some accounts where this pain medication was prescribed in the form of time-release skin patches, and people were just chewing the patches like gum in order to get a stronger hit more quickly. So let's say this is me. I'm addicted, I go in for treatment, and what happens?
Well, the official answer is that the treatment and what happens after will be specific to the individual. Depending on the substance being abused, their life situation, their needs, and unique circumstances, a treatment protocol will be developed to assist them and get their system cleared and clean and help them stay that way. One of the most important factors I want to mention, and one I think many drug users may be concerned about, even if the drug being used is illegal, according to current laws and regulations, doctors are, unless you're a threat to yourself or others, not legally obligated to report your drug use to local police or other law enforcement agencies. While there are other possible mitigating circumstances, medical professionals are there to help you with your desire to overcome your addiction and help you get well. In most cases, theoretically, a patient isn't going to face jail time or other consequences of that nature because they admit to their practitioner that they need help. In practice, however, I don't know whether this is true or not. What are your thoughts, Liz? What does the process actually look like if an addict decides to admit themselves for treatment?
First, I want to say I have a lot of experience trying to help people with substance use disorders get the help they need. And this is an area in particular that I'm passionate about. I have sat with people that were just brought back from death and people that were still drunk and made countless phone calls to help them get connected to services they need. What the process should look like and what the process actually looks like are not aligned, and a lot of it has to do with the stigma of addiction. Even medical professionals have this stigma, and to be fair to them, they receive very limited training in addiction treatment. Hospital social workers are overworked, with more cases than they have time for, and there are not enough resources to help the amount of people that are asking. I'll talk about each of those individually. The hospitals I work with are in an urban area with a high traffic of drug use and crime. Just in the last 2 months of this year, we received over 80 phone calls for Narcan reversals or substance abuse issues. Our job is to meet the patient in the ER, despite their condition, and try to get them help, if they want it. Some of them do not, but others desperately do. Because of the amount of calls for just substance use, you can imagine how overwhelmed these emergency rooms are. You can also bet that some of those people were not first-time visitors or even first-time overdoses. Just like the rest of society, a medical professional that is in the middle of their third 12-hour shift in just a few days, the empathy level is low and the treatment suffers as a result.
You're doing a really good job of setting the scene. I can almost picture it, but I don't think I like where this is headed. So I'm trying to see this. You're meeting these folks in their hospital rooms.
Well, most of the addicts I see aren't even given a room in the ER. Some are left on a gurney until they come to, and then just discharged because they are considered medically cleared. We try to break the cycle of repeat visits by intervening. Normally, that would be a social worker's job, but there are simply more patients than there are social workers. Additionally, there is a severe lack of treatment facilities with open beds to provide the services needed. So let me give you a scenario that I see all the time. It's 1 a.m., a person is found overdosed on an opioid cocktail, let's say a heroin-fentanyl mix for the sake of this example, and the ambulance comes to administer Narcan, which they have to do several times because Narcan is not meant for something as powerful as fentanyl. The patient is transported to the hospital for further treatment, like IV fluids, etc. Now the patient gets to the hospital and asks for help from the medical staff.
Sure. So they admit the patient, call the doctor, and the social worker.
Well, the social worker doesn't come in until 8 a.m. the next day, and they're not admitting the patient, so that option is out. What next? Well, the patient has a physical dependence on opioids, so the recommendation is usually going to start with a detox. But there's no one with the patient to help them navigate how to get those services, and the hospital staff will not prescribe methadone or Suboxone as it's not considered necessary, and from the doctors I've spoken to, it's a liability they simply do not want to take on.
And you said before that in a lot of these cases, it's not the person's first overdose.
Right. Let's say for this example, the patient has been in treatment before and is savvy enough to make the phone calls and lucky enough to have insurance. They have to wait until there's an opening and they are told the next bed won't open for 5 days. So please call back every morning at 7 a.m. to see if we have space available. What do you think the likelihood is that that person is going to make it for 5 days before they can get admitted into a detox, assuming they even have some type of insurance that would cover it? This example is the reality that people face when they are just trying to get help.
That's a pretty awful scenario, especially for a condition that's very often life-threatening. So what about the fortunate few who are admitted?
Well, there's a whole different reality when they actually can get help. If this person is lucky enough to get into a detox, their length of stay can vary. But on average, with the detoxes I deal with most, it's between 4 and 5 days, even though the recommendation for opioid detox, according to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, is 7 to 10 days. The person is usually administered some kind of medication to ease withdrawal symptoms, like methadone or Suboxone, and discharged. Meanwhile, the withdrawal symptoms of opioids can last much longer. In fact, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration says it can take 1 to 2 months until a patient reaches stabilization. Yet, the cycle of 4 to 5 day detox phases, or as people that are addicted call them, tune-ups, is very common and provides limited psychological counseling, connection to further services, and most importantly, poor success rates.
So it sounds like even if a person is admitted and gets some help, it's very minimal help. Let's continue down this path and say the person manages to make it through this stage, mostly on their own apparently. What happens next?
The next phase of the treatment plan would likely be a transition into some kind of inpatient rehabilitation facility, and the recommendation for a stay in rehab is usually 90 days. Most actually only last 21 to 28 days, but in my experience, because of the lack of beds and resources, most detoxes are recommending outpatient programs instead.
So, could you contrast the inpatient versus outpatient differences for us?
To define the differences for our listeners, an inpatient program is when a patient stays in a safe facility, is monitored by a medical staff, and is provided counseling, group therapy, and other services to assist in creating success. Where a person goes for about 4 to 6 hours a day, 3 days out of the week, to a facility and participates in counseling, group therapy, etc. It's cheaper to have outpatient facilities set up, and they do work well for people that are transitioning out of an inpatient facility. But going right from a tune-up and detox on Thursday morning and being told to show up Monday morning for an outpatient with a long weekend of withdrawal symptoms in between, well, it's not hard to guess the success rate of that treatment plan. There are a lot of other stories I could share with you about how pregnant women's treatment options differ, or how people that aren't considered physically addicted have an even harder time getting help, or how I've seen people deny detox treatment because they didn't use enough opioids to be approved for treatment by their insurance provider. or how people with substance abuse issues have had to resort to walking into emergency rooms claiming they want to commit suicide in order to get help because hospitals are required to at least evaluate them before discharge. But we don't have time for all of them. In my ideal world, people would get the programs they need at the time they need them and for the time they need them, with access to links after a successful completion that would link them to jobs, housing, transportation, school, whatever else would reintroduce them into society. Some places do provide these things, but most people with substance use disorders get lost in the cycle and never quite make it out. When 1 in 10 people in the US have a substance use disorder, there's likely a few people you know that have seen this struggle firsthand. Why does this need to be fixed? Drug overdose is the leading cause of accidental death in this country, according to the American Society of Addiction Medicine. And prescription pain medication that patients get from doctors has a higher rate than the heroin you would buy on the street.
That all sounds pretty logical. So, what are the problems with this approach? If I had to guess one of the problems, I would imagine that, as we continue to imagine me as the person seeking help, that I'd be at risk of falling back into the same patterns and behaviors I did before, especially if it was a social drug like marijuana, and I'm still trying to hang out with the same friends. That would be dangerous. I can imagine someone at rehab saying, "You just need to get new friends, Mike." But the users in your life might be your coworkers, your family, or your spouse. It's easy to say, avoid those problem people, but you might be asking someone to change their lives in huge ways with a simple suggestion.
Unfortunately, when it comes to recovering from addiction, there are an endless series of difficult changes to be made and a perpetual series of tests to willpower. One of the reasons staying clean is so difficult is that the factors that play into encouraging a drug addiction don't just disappear overnight. Whether it's a family member, a friend, a job, a stressful significant other, life is constantly full of reasons to return to familiar coping habits. Medical professionals do our best to make it sound easy. Use this patch, see a counselor, join this talk therapy group. But a majority of the real work in dealing with addiction comes solely from the patients themselves.
100% agree with everything Brandon said. It's nowhere near as easy as just showing up at an appointment and just changing everything in your life that could potentially trigger you to start using again. I mean, really, imagine if you found out that you had some terminal illness like cancer, and the doctor or counselor said to you, you have a better chance of surviving this if you move out of the home you're in, change all of your friends, and find a job that is more conducive to your recovery. That's crazy talk, but sometimes it can be necessary for people to get into substance use recovery. Additionally, people with substance use disorders are usually starting their recovery journey with other baggage like a mountain of debt, open warrants and legal troubles, co-occurring illnesses, or an open child protective service case. Now try to make all those changes and deal with those two. The odds are stacked against you, but people still have success. When I first got introduced to recovery, I was told to change or die, because that's how serious this is. My life was on the line. It sounds a bit dramatic, but this is in fact a terminal illness I'm dealing with. So when I asked, what do I have to change? The response was everything, which was obviously a bit overwhelming. And while I didn't change everything overnight, everything did have to change, and it has. I truly believe it saved my life.
In my research, I discovered that the European country Portugal had decriminalized all drugs in 2001. They redirected the money they were spending fighting the drug war into programs to help folks with substance abuse. Brandon, can you break down the concept and the results that Portugal's had? And would the approach work in the US? Portugal has a population of 10 million, while the US has a population of around 300 million.
Portugal, at one time, had one of the highest rates of addiction of any country in the world. Apparently, almost 1% of its population was addicted to heroin, a terrifying number. After imposing more and more stringent and unforgiving punishments onto drug users for a number of years, it was decided that a different tact would be taken. In 2001, Portugal legalized all drugs. Yes, all of them, not just the cuddlier ones like marijuana, and put all of the funding that would have gone into punishing users and enforcing policy into programs to help recovering addicts get their lives back on track. In the United States, we've been fighting the war on drugs for some time, a key principle of which is the idea that if we don't actively fight to keep illegal drugs from being available, the rates of death and injury would skyrocket, right alongside the number of people becoming addicted to these substances.
That would be a never-ending Mardi Gras. Chaos! But apparently that wasn't the case.
Indeed, it was not. On the contrary, numbers show an improvement in a number of areas. According to the Transform Drug Policy Foundation, which, full disclosure, advocates ending the war on drugs, drug use among young adults has decreased, and even drug use among adults in Portugal has declined slightly. Perhaps the most significant decrease, according to their report, is the decrease in contraction of HIV among active drug users. According to more recent figures from the European Monitoring Center for Drugs and Drug Addiction, another possibly startling pattern emerges. According to the statistics for 2017, Portugal has an average of 8 drug-induced deaths per million citizens. The United States, just for comparison, had somewhere in the range of 185 drug-induced deaths per million citizens.
All of this data is fascinating, and it seems to me that the picture you've painted makes a strong case for legalizing drugs here in the US. In fact, it seems almost too good to be true, which means you undoubtedly have a few warnings and buzzkills in store for us.
Sheesh, I know I have a dark outlook on things, but I'm sorry I've made such a bad impression on you. That said, I do have a few things I want to mention before everyone's encouraged towards any specific form of thought. It is true that possession of drugs in Portugal has been decriminalized, but there are stipulations, which I am admittedly taking from some pretty secondhand sources here, so take the details with a grain of salt. An individual can have up to a 10-day supply of more or less any substance with no legal ramifications. However, trafficking a fair number of these same substances is still illegal, punishable by up to 12 years imprisonment depending on the substance. Does that change anything about legalization and its place in addiction treatment? Not necessarily. Ideally, drugs provided to citizens would come from a trustworthy and comparatively safe source, and having untraceable or unregistered people providing those drugs would put a damper on that. So, the laws, if anything, could be thought of as an additional layer of protection to those people choosing to use any given substance.
This is such a great topic, and it's really revolutionary in the fight to save people's lives, as well as the national debate on marijuana legalization. The Portuguese, outside-of-the-box thinking, has been a real eye-opener for people, and they are not the only ones in the start of reevaluating conventional methods of treatment. In 2016, Canada approved the legalization of prescription heroin in hopes of expanding the options for treatment available to addicts. I know to most people that sounds crazy, doctors prescribing heroin. But newsflash, they are in fact prescribing very strong opioids for pain management already, and it's really not much different than the idea of a methadone clinic. Canadians have also extended a program where addicts can bring drugs from off the street and administer them to themselves in a controlled environment. These programs are set up for people where traditional treatment has not been successful in the past. In the last few years, we've seen a state-level movement here in the U.S. toward the legalization of marijuana. You may remember that funny story from 2014 about Girl Scout cookies reaching record sales outside of a medical marijuana dispensary in San Francisco. While there is some lighthearted humor around the topic, the debate here still rages on. There have been some immediate findings since the legalization that should get some attention and conversation going. In 2016, the Washington Post published an article addressing this topic and pointed out that arrests have gone down, tax revenue had gone up, youth marijuana use and traffic incidents had remained steady, but that infant marijuana poisoning may have increased slightly, as well as marijuana-related ER visits in the states of Washington and Colorado. People can take what they will from that, but I'd say it's a win. What we do know is that the National Institute on Drug Abuse reported abuse of tobacco, alcohol, and illicit drugs is costly to our nation, exacting more than $740 billion annually in costs related to crime, lost work productivity, and healthcare. And if you take tobacco out of that equation, it's still well over $400 billion annually. To give you some kind of comparison, the American Cancer Society says overall annual cost for cancer healthcare is closer to $90 billion. I was at a regional advocacy event a few weeks ago where we did a screening for the film The Anonymous People at a local university, and one of our state senators came for the screening. Afterward, a panel of people gave brief testimonials about how addiction had impacted their lives, and then the floor was open for questions. The senator asked the panel whether or not they thought marijuana should be legalized, and just like the rest of society, the group was split on the answer. One person in the panel who was a recovering addict felt it should stay illegal, while a psychologist that specializes in addiction treatment felt it should be legalized. Both had good reasons, so it just proves that there isn't a simple answer, and it's a complicated question. Aside from the clear benefits of tax revenue increase and less arrests, I think the legalization of drugs sort of takes the danger and excitement out of using, which is one of the psychological rewirings that needs to be dealt with. It's almost an addiction to the lifestyle as much as the drugs. When you've lived a life of substance use, you are used to chaos and drama all day, every day. Leading a normal life is bizarre to someone that has lived an active addiction. The idea of going to a clinic 3 times a day and being shot up, or going to a clinic every day and having a nurse watch you shoot up is not that exciting. In fact, it's pretty lame. This could allow for an introduction to long-term abstinence. Additionally, the increased tax revenue can and should be used toward prevention and treatment for everyone. Then, if marijuana truly is a gateway drug, all of these overdose numbers should drop quickly.
You know, at this point, I just want to go on record as saying that I have actually been a proponent for the legalization of drugs for some time, although not from a political or medical standpoint, but more from my personal feelings on human nature. I feel like if people on any side of our current discussion can agree on anything, it would be this, that there are always going to be people who choose to use drugs. Regardless of how illegal they may be, or how hard to obtain, or how costly, drug use will exist. As things stand, the most desperate individuals have no choice but to resort to buying and using whatever they can, which means a host of dangers above and beyond those caused by the substances themselves. Impure drugs, unclean needles, inaccessibility of emergency healthcare in the event of some sort of incredible emergency. By stigmatizing all aspects of drug use, we are unquestionably adding to the risks for people who choose to use drugs.
Exactly. If the war on drugs has proven anything, it's that criminalization and public shaming do not keep people from doing drugs any more than calling a person fat keeps them from overeating. Education, support, psychological treatment, and a bridge back to a healthy life for the individual stops people from doing things that harm themselves.
So does this tie into my question about Portugal? Or is this some kind of tangential discussion?
Can it be both? In all seriousness, though, it was intended to lead me to what I consider possibly the key statistic regarding Portugal. If we accept that there are negative results to treating drug possession and use in our extant system, it follows that, since we are sticking to them, there must be positive results that outweigh these risks. Supporters of the current methodology for addiction treatment and drug control rely on one statement unequivocally. If drugs are legalized, their use in the population will increase significantly. Portugal, however, has shown no such increase. Of course, things could play out differently in the US or the EU, but if such a fundamental aspect of our current methodology has been shown to be flawed, even once, it seems to me that it's at least worthwhile to consider that there may be a need to scrutinize what we have been taught regarding both how we combat inappropriate drug use and how we deal with those individuals who have become addicted to those substances.
Right. So, what are you saying?
Well, I'm not saying that exactly the same methods used in Portugal will work in a country like the United States. The social climate here is pretty different, as is our total population. So, what do you think, Liz? If push came to shove, what do you think would be the roadblocks or even the pieces that would adapt well in taking an approach similar to Portugal's here in the US? And I'll interrupt before you even begin by saying that my concerns revolve around the money-centric and egocentric tendencies of the average citizen. If it isn't me that's addicted and receiving government assistance as a result, why should my tax dollars go towards something I might perceive as a reward for becoming addicted to drugs?
It's an interesting thought. What if all drugs were made legal tomorrow? What then? I think there would probably be an initial backlash for sure, but we do have a point of reference in our own history to look back on for insight. After all, this country did make alcohol illegal from 1920 to 1933, and then re-legalized it. If you look back on that period of time when alcohol was illegal, you saw a rise in crime in the form of bootleg alcohol distribution, speakeasies, medical prescriptions for alcohol, which were then abused, and organized crime. If you look at the drug traffic industry today, it's not much different than that point in American history. Illegal distributors are cutting the pure drugs with less quality ingredients. Speakeasies could be compared to drug dens, otherwise known as crack houses and shooting galleries. Overprescription of pain medication and abuse is rising dramatically, And the organized crime is just smarter and faster, mostly due to the technological innovations that have taken place since.
But what happened in 1933 when we re-legalized alcohol? Did people start going crazy, drinking more? Did people that did not drink in that 13-year period suddenly start drinking and become alcoholics? I think we have the answer to that question, as it's been legalized ever since, and we don't have a whole country of alcoholics stumbling around collecting government assistance.
Exactly. As a side note, tobacco has always been legalized in this country, yet not everyone smokes. Not everyone that tries smoking becomes a lifetime smoker that ends in lung cancer or any of the other numerous negative effects of smoking. That said, the recently deceased comedian Ralphie May did a bit about the legalization of marijuana, and although meant to be humorous, made good points about how we should approach those money-centric and egocentric people you mentioned. He suggested taking a less people are dying approach, and instead a more economic approach of using the tax revenue for those people in such a way that they would benefit, like lower taxes, lower judicial system costs, free parks and roads, etc. And 40% less traffic in their commute, as stoners would be too busy smoking weed after work and too stoned to bother to sit in traffic. While it's a good bit, you have to consider that people don't particularly care about an issue until it affects them in some way, and maybe those money-centric, egocentric people you mentioned just need to be sold in the right way. Speaking of which, I can go into a whole rant about the terminology around the opioid epidemic and how now that white people in suburbs are dying, lawmakers suddenly have an epidemic on their hands. But that's another talk around white privilege, I think. The point is, if you talk to people at their level and make intelligent points about how this change is good for them, only then do things change.
That's definitely a discussion that could take up a whole series of episodes. But let's change gears a bit here. Brandon, one perspective we overlook more than I would like in these episodes is the Chinese medicine angle. It's your specialty, after all. Are there any specific Chinese medicine approaches, treatments, or herbs that do or could or should play a role in Western approaches to rehabilitation? Or is this just another instance where the Western model is the best bet?
When it comes to treating addiction, it's my opinion that using almost any available models of medicine would be a good idea. When it comes to Chinese medicine, there are actually a number of things practitioners like myself can do to help a patient overcome their addiction. Medicinal herbs, which I want to stress will never be enough by themselves to stop an addiction, can be incredibly helpful. We've mentioned Gogen, also known as kudzu, in our previous episode about alcohol. Modern studies have shown that an extract of this herb can be effective in curbing the desire for alcoholic consumption. More recently, an herb commonly called kratom has garnered national interest. Initial studies are indicating that this herb, when used correctly, can be helpful in reducing and controlling opioid withdrawal symptoms. Full disclosure on this one, though. Studies are also showing that misusing kratom can also lead to addiction and withdrawal effects.
We mention herbal medicines quite a lot, but acupuncture uses needles, right? If I came to you, my acupuncture physician, asking for assistance overcoming my addiction, would you use other treatment modalities, or would it be herbal remedies all the way?
I don't want us to get too far off topic, but you bring up a good point I've been meaning to touch on for some time. I do my best to base what I say in these episodes on research which is considered acceptable by the average American, which means coming from a reputable source, things like a national institute, a certified educational body, or a peer-reviewed journal. On one hand, that's a good thing. It means reproducible results that come from the same place as, say, proofs that a pharmaceutical is good for a specific condition. On the other hand, viable studies are both hard to find and difficult to create. Without getting too specific, controlling for all possible factors in a study regarding the efficacy of a set of acupuncture points is almost impossible, especially without significant funding, which is difficult to obtain for the majority of acupuncturists in the U.S.
I'm sensing a but coming up.
Again, I really don't want us to get too far off topic, but herbal medicine, for various reasons, lends itself to testing more readily than other modalities acupuncturists use. So I end up talking about herbal medicines more. There are definitely other treatments that can help. There are acupuncture treatments that can, in the right circumstances, help reduce cravings or mitigate the experience of withdrawal symptoms. There are needle protocols using as few as 2 needle insertions that have been shown to help smokers break their addiction. A few recent studies have shown electric stimulation of acupuncture points can have a positive result for patients trying to stop using drugs like heroin. Acupuncture has also been shown to be effective at pain reduction and control, which could be key to helping resolve the opioid epidemic going on here in the United States.
Speaking of China, I'm reminded of a book I read a long time ago. It's called 1421, The Year China Discovered America. The book describes this giant fleet of sea vessels that discovered the Americas, Australia, and more. Once the voyage was concluded, the Chinese emperor and his advisors decided that further voyages would be too hard on the Chinese economy, and China cut off sea exploration for many years to come. How different a world we would live in if China had installed colonies around the world rather than Spain and the UK.
That's a nice story, but you do realize most of that book's facts have been discredited.
Oh yeah, you're right about that. But it still works as a narrative device. See, the war on drugs is a similar world-changing shift in government agenda. Addiction recovery reform had been building in the U.S. since before Alcoholics Anonymous was founded in 1935, and had made some great strides in the late 60s with a series of congressional hearings chaired by Senator Harold Hughes, a recovering alcoholic himself, who established a special subcommittee on alcoholism and narcotics, which led, among other things, to the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act of 1970. It appeared that the national viewpoint of drug abuse and addiction as criminal and immoral, rather than a disease that could be treated, was about to change. And then we had the war on drugs in 1971.
Indeed we did. Did I miss a question?
I don't really have a question. It's just interesting and chilling to realize that a shift in a political platform can change the world. I mean, U.S. President Harry Truman wanted to move the country towards socialized medicine, but with the rise of communism in the dawn of the Cold War, proposing anything even vaguely socialist would be political suicide. Why? Because helping and understanding people is seen as weak, and punishing them is seen as strong. And I don't know that...
Okay, Mike. While all of this is very interesting, I think you're drifting off topic. Maybe we can continue this discussion after our guest has escaped from the recording booth.
I'm sorry about that. You're right. Do you have any on-topic comments regarding my rant, then?
I can probably put us back on track, yeah. If nothing else, your story makes it apparent just how much society drives medicine. Addiction is a good example. Public and political opinion sway one way, and medicine begins to treat people who are addicted to a drug as criminals. As it sways the other way, addiction begins to be seen as an illness, not to be treated with punishment, but with medicine and rehabilitation. The nature of the problem, the symptoms, the causes, they haven't changed in any sense of reality.
So we've talked about some very basic concepts when it comes to how addiction works. Modern treatment, modern recovery, some of the problems. But what are some of the newer approaches or solutions? And how are they any better than what we've been doing? Just off the top of my head, the whole approach to just say no and demanding capital A abstinence in general leaves folks poorly prepared for the realities of life. Because as soon as you've crossed the line from never done it to doing it, you're suddenly in completely uncharted waters without a compass.
Fighting addiction and drug use in general, by teaching children to just say no, isn't really a solution at all. And here's a non sequitur. Think about trying to teach a child not to touch a hot stove. Most, if not all, parents have firmly instructed their children at one point or another not to touch something because it's hot. Eventually, though, common knowledge agrees that the child will ignore the warnings and burn themselves. What would happen if we just stopped there? Okay, youngin', Mama said not to touch that, so now good luck dealing with the consequences. Oh, and also, there may be fines and jail time now. What happens in actuality, though? The child is taken aside, comforted, the wound is dressed and medical treatment applied, hopefully nothing more needed than a little burn cream and a kiss, of course. And the lesson is reiterated. Now the child knows the warning, what happens if it isn't followed, and most importantly, what to do if it does happen again. It isn't the same situation, of course, but the methodology remains. Educate not just about the evils, the warning, but about the process, and make sure access to treatment is not only acceptable, but available.
Great points, Brandon. It's an interesting thought to wonder what might happen if parents sat down with their kids after trying something like marijuana and talk to them about the experience, perhaps being honest about their own experience in that area and creating an open communication forum of honesty and support instead of punishment. I certainly didn't have that growing up. So it encouraged the secretive behavior that addicts really become masters of. So I'm not sure how that might work. What I can say is that I've seen dramatic changes in the last 20 years or so in the form of addiction treatment options and access points for help. As an example, when I was in the midst of my drug use, I didn't even know that treatment was an option. And this is going to sound silly today, but I thought you had to have money and be a celebrity to get help. I didn't even know where I would get help if I wanted it. How crazy is that? I'm addicted to drugs. I know what I'm doing is illegal and carries a ton of shame for the people I love, and I want to stop, but I'm too afraid or lack the information to ask for help.
But it seems like things are very slowly moving in a better direction these days.
Today I see commercials for all kinds of assistance with drug problems on TV. Things that say, do you have a problem with drugs? Call this 800 number and get help. I see advertisements on billboards and on the sides of buses for medication-assisted treatments like Vivitrol. There's at least some change in that kind of promotion of help for people. So there has been some improvement in at least getting the word out. As with most things, 2 steps forward usually means at least 1 step back. And while there's plenty of advertising out there for help, not all of it is with best intentions. As Chris Rock said in his bit about why AIDS will never be cured, there ain't no money in the cure, the money's in the medicine. And as much as there are truly advocates for changing the system to help addicts, there are those who would take advantage of the opportunity.
Indeed, including some severe issues at treatment centers, I believe.
Yeah, there have been many stories as of late about corruption in treatment centers. The most recent I can think of in memory was a bust in Florida, where an owner of a rehab and a halfway house was arrested for charging insurance companies more than $58 million for services not provided. And to take it even further, was luring people with substance use disorders to his location with gift cards, visits to strip clubs, and even drugs. This is just one story of many where people are seeking help and instead are taken advantage of for money. I encourage any listener to do their research when seeking help. Sometimes things look great in brochures and on websites, but can actually be highly detrimental to the person seeking help.
Strangely enough, there's another word that might have seemed like a good idea, but might be another hindrance. Anonymity. Many recovery groups focus on the members remaining anonymous. That only seems to amplify this stigma. As an ignorant person who's never been through this, I can see some logic to a new member of a recovery group not wanting to announce their dilemma to everyone at their work, to all their friends, everyone at their church on day one. But staying silent also prevents these folks from being a known resource in their communities. In an example, that being an addict in recovery doesn't mean you can't lead a full and productive life. So what's the problem with anonymity?
This topic of anonymity is so important to changing the stigma and just changing things in general. There's no problem per se with anonymity. In fact, it was pretty necessary for some to remain anonymous in order to get help, but also not be linked to the stigma associated with addiction. When I first entered recovery, I was pretty ignorant to why anonymity was even necessary or important. I didn't really care who knew that I was in recovery. One of the first things I did when I got clean was go back to college, and I remember taking a sociology class. In one assignment on stereotypes and how they shape our thinking, the teacher posed questions to the group in order to see what kind of responses they would give. As an example, the teacher would ask something like, if your sibling brought a new girlfriend or boyfriend of a different religion to a family function, what would you do or say? Most people agreed that it wasn't of any consequence to bring home someone with a different religious background, and that they are accepting of all religions. When the teacher asked, if your sibling brought a new girlfriend or boyfriend that was a recovering drug addict to a family function, what would you do or say? Not a single person in the class was okay with it. Many people said they'd hide their purse or wallet and tell their sibling that it wasn't a good fit because the person was probably a criminal and just using them and would relapse anyway.
Wow, I'm sorry. And how did you respond to that?
I was sitting in a classroom, a person themselves in recovery, ashamed and appalled. That's when I realized why anonymity was important for many people in recovery. People have ideas in their heads, and sometimes if those ideas are projected onto you, there can be serious consequences. But how do we change those ideas by saying nothing? I often regret not standing up for myself in that class to possibly change one person's outlook. In advocacy, we are trying to change the system so that addicts are treated fairly in healthcare. that a terminal mental disorder is not being treated with incarceration, and many other issues surrounding this topic. Today, if I decided to remain anonymous and not let anyone know how I survived, and that there is hope for sustaining long-term recovery, then what kind of advocate am I? You can look at any civil rights movement in history and see that until people stood up and fought for their own rights while convincing others to fight with them, there was no significant change. The best example I can think of, and pretty comparable actually in my lifetime, has been the gay rights movement. After a significant enough event caused enough anger to push people into advocacy, suddenly people started coming out, organizing and fighting for rights. People in long-term recovery need to come out of church basements and get to work because we are worth saving, but we are dying and these deaths are preventable.
There are a number of ways to struggle against addiction and attempt recovery. One of these is called going cold turkey, where a person suffering from addiction just decides one day to stop taking their addictive substance of choice and abruptly stops use completely. Actually, accomplishing an attempt to go cold turkey would be an amazing force of will, fighting not just physical dependence, but psychological gravity well of the drug, withdrawal symptoms as well. So, Brandon, is going cold turkey a good approach?
Well, it seems to work for some people, but you have to be careful. In the case of nicotine, going cold turkey can be okay. The withdrawal symptoms aren't likely to kill you. With long-term alcohol use, however, sudden withdrawal can actually lead to death. What's your experience tell you about using cold turkey as a viable approach to breaking addiction, Liz?
So before I answer this question, I want to point out that I'm not a medical professional, nor am I an expert in the science of mental health, so this answer is based on my personal experience only. Okay, now that that's out of the way, when it comes to the cold turkey approach to addiction, I've heard of such miracles happening, but it's not something that's ever happened to me. I never just woke up during my using days and said, okay, I'm done, and that was it. But there are 3 things I want to mention that I think are important regarding this topic. The first is that we mentioned the DSM earlier being in its 5th edition and describing substance use disorder on a scale instead of as a black and white diagnosis. I've seen people in my life that use drugs the way I did and appeared to just grow out of it and stop. Some people would call that cold turkey. I'd say they simply weren't on the same part of the scale as me, or simply don't have a substance use disorder at all.
Hold up. I'm not sure I'm really getting what you mean.
Yeah, that might sound confusing, so I'll give an example to compare with. I think we can all agree that all people have bouts of depression in their lives. Maybe the loss of a loved one or a job that puts us into a depressed state for a fixed amount of time. Maybe it's hard to get off the couch and complete basic daily tasks like showering. That amount of time can vary from person to person, but eventually things turn around and the grieving process allows us to pick ourselves up and move forward. Meanwhile, there is a completely separate diagnosis for a person suffering from depression as a medical disorder. This person does not snap out of it, and it isn't for a fixed amount of time. They are diagnosed and hopefully treated. If we think about addiction in the same way, we can say, okay, it's possible to go through a period of time in my life where I have a substance use issue, and that I realize at some point it's not the direction I want my life to take, so I make some changes and move forward. People with legitimate substance use disorders usually do not have this ability and will need treatment in order to deal with their symptoms.
Okay, that makes more sense. I get it. So what's point number 2?
The second point I want to make is when people use the phrase cold turkey, they usually don't follow it up with any kind of study to see the impact of that approach. In my experience, addiction is not a singular thing. And this goes back to what Mike said earlier in our discussion. Addiction takes many forms: gambling, drugs, food, sex, exercise, etc. And when one of those symptoms of use is cut off, usually another flares up. It's no coincidence that people gain weight when they quit smoking, or people that get bariatric surgery to lose weight are questioned about their alcohol consumption before surgery. Usually, if you take away one coping mechanism without the therapy needed to replace them, people find a way to cope.
Well said. What's the third point?
The third and final point I want to make is that those in the cold turkey world of substance use disorders usually have a lot of things in their life that addiction treatment try to provide. As an example, let's say there's this guy named Al that had a really bad problem with alcohol and suddenly appeared to stop one day because he found religion and believes that God intervened and saved him. Al has stopped drinking, become more active in his religious community, formed friendships, got a job, helps out with his community, and is generally a happy person these days. We could say that Al stopped cold turkey and woke up one day to realize that his path should go in a different direction, and this would be true. But we could also say that Al was reconnected back to society via his religious institution that provided a lot of the things that actual substance use treatment would. Counseling of its religious leaders, a sense of purpose, and most importantly, a reason to change its behavior in the form of hope. Just as substance use disorders are never black or white and usually don't have a single diagnosis or treatment plan for every individual that suffers from them, the cold turkey solution is never usually as simple as, I just woke up and quit. People need something to replace that behavior with, and they need a support system to do it. Sometimes that support system is positive and can create real substantial change. Other times that support system is just a replacement with another symptom of addiction.
As you might expect from any problem that's been with humans since our beginnings, there are a lot of, I don't want to call them home remedies, but there are non-medical approaches to addiction recovery. There are a lot of, I don't know the proper term, I guess I'd call them new age solutions. These are things like meditation, apple cider vinegar, art therapy, changes to your diet, practicing yoga, pet therapy, plant therapy, hypnosis, proper hydration, fish oils, herbs such as skullcap, milk thistle, ginkgo biloba, the list goes on. Now, if I'm a hardcore meth or heroin addict, I really can't see a little yoga taking the place of the mental and physical dependence of the drug. I suppose taking any action in the, I have made the decision, I want to change my behavior, I need to stop this, direction, it's got to be a good thing, right? An important step. And if hypnosis and ginkgo biloba doesn't work, a person would then, hopefully, move on to more advanced recovery methods. But it seems clear to me that this is a whole different world than trying to decide if the best fitness approach for me is Zumba or Taibo, because my addiction could kill me, my loved ones, or even some random strangers, while I'm trying to figure out that these new age solutions aren't solving anything.
I don't know that the thought process of moving on to more advanced recovery methods is the right one to have. You are correct, at least, that selecting the best methods as soon as possible is going to make recovering from an addiction as easy as possible. But resolving an addiction isn't something that can be solved by a blanket selection of options. Pharmacological, psychological, physical, when it comes to addiction, it's my opinion that introducing oneself to the entirety of options available is by and away the best choice. I would almost go as far as to say that limiting yourself to only the options that are in your comfort zone is going to be more of a hindrance than a help.
You might be surprised to know there is a pretty strong correlation between recovery and new age health treatments, but not in such a way that people think it's a cure necessarily. What we're talking about here is healthy behaviors replacing unhealthy ones. I know a lot of people in recovery that turn to yoga or meditation practices of all forms as outlets and to provide them with those fundamental coping skills. However, I don't think you can just come off a meth or heroin habit by buying a yoga mat and centering yourself with breathing practices. If there's anyone that's done that, I'd like to meet them. As far as I know, and I would very much like to know if I'm wrong, substance use disorder has no cure. So no herbal remedy or meditative practice alone will treat someone in the grips of addiction. However, those practices in combination with therapy, reconnection to society, and a newfound purpose is certainly a good start.
Aside from the possible remedies we've just mentioned, I also came across a couple of drugs, herbs, substances. They're being tried out by some folks fighting addiction. Brandon, what can you tell us about ibogaine and baclofen? The answers are sure to be complicated, so maybe just a quick mention of each.
Sure thing. Just keep in mind that I'm definitely going to be simplifying. Ibogaine isn't really a viable or acceptable option at this point in terms of treatment of addiction. In natural form, it's found as an alkaloid in some plants, which began their use in African spiritual traditions. In the 1960s, it was discovered, in an unofficial way, to reduce the cravings and withdrawal symptoms in a small group of heroin users. It has been studied, mostly in less than scientific ways, but it has also been shown to be cardiotoxic and cause ataxia, which is a neurological issue involving muscle control. Baclofen is in a somewhat similar state. It's utilized in an official capacity as a muscle relaxant and pain reliever, but has shown in some cases to help in breaking the addiction cycle, especially in those cases involving alcohol and cocaine use. Studies are still ongoing, but the use of baclofen for treating addiction is still off-label, meaning that, according to the FDA, the jury's still out. I wanted to ask you, though, Liz, do you have any direct experience with these particular drugs?
Actually, I don't. The only medication-assisted treatment that I'm aware of on the market and have had some secondhand experience with are methadone, Suboxone, and Vivitrol. But to be honest, I'm not a doctor, and I don't want to speak to their success or failure rates. Drugs like methadone and Suboxone are meant to ease the physical symptoms of opioid withdrawal and then be tapered off, kind of the way Chantix works for quitting smoking. However, what I've seen is that people end up staying on either drug for sometimes decades and just form a new habit for themselves. To be honest, I used to be very much against medicated assisted treatment for that reason, but I've since changed my view and believe that any treatment to get someone off of street drugs and a bridge back to a healthier life is a successful step in the right direction.
Liz, what can you tell us about your story and troubles, as detailed as you'd like to be, and most importantly, how you entered the recovery part of your life? And let us know if recovery worked right away, or if there were a few attempts to get it right.
That's a super long answer, so I'll just try to keep it concise. What I can tell you, and what I think is common amongst most people that struggle with addiction, is that I was a very sensitive kid that never really felt like they fit in anywhere, even with my family. I just always felt different, and I struggled to process emotions, so I learned at a very young age to put up a lot of walls and sort of fake it, which contributed to my manipulative behaviors later on. I tried to fit in everywhere. I wanted to be accepted and liked, which everyone wants, but I didn't have the coping skills to deal with failure and rejection. I started to develop obsessive and compulsive behaviors to keep myself from failing and became distanced from people as a result. I was always curious about alcohol because it seemed like a cool thing to do that older people did. And so the first time I tried it, I really had no idea what I was getting into. The first time I got drunk, which was the first time I ever drank, I remember all of those anxieties and fears that I had been carrying around my whole life disappearing and feeling free for the first time. I realized I had found a cure to my problem, me. From that moment on, all I wanted to do was drink. It was actually quite scary looking back that I was so obsessed with drinking. My brother brought me to my first AA meeting when I was 15. It didn't stick because, let's face it, being 15 in a church basement surrounded by people that looked ancient just wasn't going to happen.
Ah, yes, I remember being 15. It's very hard to tell a 15-year-old anything and have them accept it.
Exactly. As time went on, I was introduced to other drugs, and while I was pretty much open to try anything, I met that drug of choice I mentioned earlier when I was 17 years old. My entire life changed the first time I ever did it. I never thought I could feel that way and decided in that moment that I never wanted to feel any other way. It shut off my mind and let me just feel good. Who doesn't want that? I always describe my addiction as an abusive relationship. At first, I was infatuated with the drugs. And just like in a relationship where abuse is involved, that wears off and the real situation starts to become exposed. Suddenly, the thing that I was in love with was not loving me back. I was putting myself in dangerous situations, hurting myself and those around me, lying, manipulating, stealing, just to protect it. Saying to myself, it's everyone else, not the drugs. Those are not the problem. Or blaming myself for just not being careful enough and really believing that if I just did things right, that I wouldn't have all the problems I was having.
You're still a young thing these days, but we're talking at least 10 years ago, right? Recovery was definitely less talked about.
Well, as I mentioned, I didn't even know treatment was an option, so I tried to quit on my own many times. I tried to isolate myself from my friends and just be by myself. I tried to move far away from where I was using and thought starting my life over somewhere new where no one knew me was a solution. I tried just isolating my using to just one drug, alcohol, because it was legal. None of it lasted very long, and I kept finding myself in more dangerous situations. At the end, I wanted to die. There's no way to sugarcoat that. I had no hope to change anything, I saw no way out, and I was completely broken, yet I could not stop. I had done things for drugs that I said I would never do, and that were totally against the way I had been raised. The things I had done and the way that I had felt just fed the need to continue to use in order to cope. I was actually getting angry after drug runs that I had survived because I lived. I just wanted it to be over. It was and is a vicious cycle of hopelessness.
That's a very chilling way to help us all understand the mind space you were in. It's scary to think it could happen to any of us. So, what changed?
A friend of mine that was not an addict saw the way I was living and said to me, when you're ready to change things, give me a call and I'll help. I didn't call right away. But after some time, I called him up and I said, I need help. He helped me move out of the place I was staying that was in no way conducive to trying to change behaviors, and I started my journey to recovery. But I didn't get clean right away. I still thought I could use socially, but it was quickly revealed to me that abstinence was the only way I was going to be able to really change my life.
And when was this exactly?
I entered recovery in 2006. In the beginning, it was a struggle every single day. In fact, it was a struggle every hour. My mind had been trained for this reward system, and I knew that there was an easy fix to how I was feeling. It's like having this terrible flu and knowing that there's a medication you can take that will ease the symptoms of the flu, but also being allergic to the medication with a possible side effect of death. Taking the medication is certainly going to seem like a worthwhile option when you feel that bad.
As I mentioned before, we lived together for a few years in the early 2000s and even worked together for a while. I have to say, I never knew. You were quiet, you paid your part of the rent on time, you were a strong asset at work, you always got your assignments done, you were smart and funny and laid back. That's not the sort of behavior I would expect from a drug addict.
Earlier, I mentioned that I had trained myself to fake it as a child. That sort of evolved into leading a double life for a long time. Many addicts, if you ask them, will tell you there was a time during their using that they sort of felt like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Being different people in different social settings becomes a necessary survival skill. I was pretty good at being secretive about what was really going on, and most people wouldn't be able to spot it if they had no prior experience dealing with someone in that situation. The problem with being Jekyll and Hyde is that, just like the story, eventually Mr. Hyde takes over, and leading two separate identities becomes harder and harder. This usually happens as the money starts to run out and the need for more becomes the priority. That said, there are many functional people with substance use disorders that appear to have everything together. They can keep a job, and for the most part, their affairs are in order. Yet, behind closed doors, things are quite the opposite. Usually, in this case, they have an enabler, or many enablers, helping them keep afloat. In my experience with myself and the people I've worked with, eventually everyone loses some level of control, and they are forced to make some choices about the reality of their situation.
You were really good at it. Too good, maybe. I think that I understand that part of it a little better now. I'm sorry for this slight detour. You were talking about getting help.
Right. So I met other people that were in recovery, and that was really the tipping point for me to stay in recovery. I needed to reconnect with other people. These people weren't just random either. They weren't doctors or probation officers. They were people just like me, that had been some of the places I'd been and felt the way that I felt. I suddenly felt like I fit in somewhere, which was the thing I'd been looking for my whole life. That was not as easy as I'm making it sound, though. I had spent over a decade of my life conning people, and now I'm trying to change all those behaviors and form friendships. It takes time, and people that are used to instant gratification of drugs aren't very patient. But I hung on, and eventually things started to change. I started to change. I did a lot of one-on-one therapy as well as group therapy. I went back to school and got a real career. I reconnected with family and started to repair old relationships where I could. Nowadays, most people in my life don't even correlate me with drugs, and that life seems very far away. But I have to remind myself of the truth, that I could go back there with just one drink or misuse of a drug. So I do a lot of service work in the form of volunteering and advocacy to remind myself where I came from, and it helps keep me from going back.
We've gone over some of the options in very brief detail people might have once they've decided they want to try to break free from their addictions. And you've mentioned a nonprofit social services group that you volunteer with to help folks who might be in need of recovery. I'm not sure how to phrase it. What can you tell us about your volunteer efforts and what you're doing to help out as a certified peer recovery specialist?
I work with a few organizations that I've already mentioned, and we do the hospital visits that I went over in detail. I also have helped people in early recovery write resumes, practice interview skills, and search for jobs to try to reconnect them with a source of their own income. As a certified peer recovery specialist, I work with people either in recovery or trying to get into recovery in almost a buddy system, if that makes sense. I'm in recovery myself, obviously, so when I mentioned earlier how important it was for me to see other people that had successfully managed to change their lives, I try to be that for other people and guide them. The philosophy behind it is to meet people where they are at and not try to force my path or belief system on other people. If someone wants to change, I work with them to create a path and meet their goals. As an advocacy leader, I try to help make social changes by doing things like this and hopefully creating some awareness about what a substance use disorder is and what it isn't. I truly believe the biggest roadblock to making legitimate long-term change is the stigma that surrounds addiction. I try to focus my efforts on that. Other advocates are focused on prevention or policy change. Everyone has their forte.
An article I read mentioned an almost 40% success rate of long-term recovery when overdose patients met with a recovery specialist. This seems pretty amazing, and hopefully other groups around the country are applying the same approaches. Now, it's important to maintain confidentiality. Everything we said before about the strengths and weaknesses of anonymity, that's all still valid, but we definitely don't want to compromise anyone's trust or identity. That said, it would be interesting to hear an anonymized account of an unsuccessful patient recovery specialist meetup followed by a successful one. I'm trying to imagine the scene, and knowing you as I do, I can imagine you're pretty effective at what you're doing. Some people just seem pretentious or fake in some way, but there's a very strong no BS vibe to you, and I can see that working in your favor. Now, is your vibe unique to you, or does everyone from your hometown have a delightful directness to them?
As a recovery specialist, I'm required to go through pretty rigorous ethics training, which includes the importance of confidentiality. Trust is so important when you're trying to connect with someone that wants help. Think about it. They are used to having to lie and manipulate to survive, and they are used to being lied and manipulated to in the same way. Someone needs to offer them a safe place to be themselves that shows them that no one is trying to take advantage and just wants to help. We do that by maintaining trust and protecting their identities to the best of our ability. Just as important as trust is directness. People that have lived a life of addiction get pretty good at BSing people and also get pretty good at seeing through BS. As a result, when I talk to someone as a recovery specialist, I tell them straight up what to expect. Like, hey, going into detox is going to be super uncomfortable. You're going to start waking up feelings you've been numbing for maybe decades and probably feel like you're going through puberty again. Also, the food sucks and you won't be able to sleep. But don't worry, I'll be here to walk you through it and it'll get better. There is no point in lying about how great things are going to be. They are going to find out on their own anyway that initially quitting drugs sucks, but as time goes on, it gets better.
But you understand where they're coming from. That has to make a huge difference.
That's the difference between me talking to a person with a substance use disorder and a doctor or family member that's never actually been through it. They don't know what you're going to experience, and they are going to make it sound better than it is in order to hope you follow through with it. Knowing that someone else has been through what you are about to go through and is going to support you through it is a very powerful thing. I've had some great successes and some failures with my work as a recovery specialist.
Can you tell us a little, say, an example of each result?
Well, one that I consider a success was when I met a pregnant woman who was completely opioid dependent at one of our hospitals. She was 36 weeks into her pregnancy and getting sick from withdrawals. As a team, we were able to connect her with a program that does medicated assisted treatment through the rest of her pregnancy. She gave birth to a healthy baby boy who was kept under observation and then released home with her. Obviously, a state agency is involved in order to protect the baby and make sure that the mother is doing the right thing, but so far so good, and she has been doing great to stay with the program she's in so far. Now, I made that sound like a super easy intervention where we just met her and signed her up and moved on, but it was not that simple. We had to connect her with resources to get an ID, make phone calls to get her into the program, make arrangements with her doctor to try to keep her in the hospital while we got all that done, and make sure we got her to the clinic at 4 a.m. in order to be the first online. It was a ton of work, but in the end, a success. Both baby and mom are alive and healthy. Unfortunately, there are usually a lot more failures than successes, and this can grind on you. Instead of talking about a specific case that I've seen fail, I think it's more important to talk about the system of care and where I see failures happening most. Usually, when I've seen a person refuse or fail to follow through with treatment, it's because those treatment plans I mentioned earlier have gaps in them and end up allowing people to fall through. I worked with a gentleman that was super unwilling to accept help, but after a few months of talking to him, he opened up more and started to trust that I wasn't trying to get anything from him. Eventually, he agreed to go into detox and had success, so he went on to rehab, where he managed to stay through its completion. When he got out, he had over 30 days clean of drugs, which was the most he had collected since he started using. He was supposed to start an outpatient program a few days later, but there was no follow-up, and I believe a little too much freedom for him too soon. I think it wasn't the right call for a treatment plan, so he eventually disappeared and started using again. To this day, I don't know where he is or how he is, which is heartbreaking.
What have you learned during the recovery specialist process? Are there certain approaches or things you've learned to say or do or not to say or do after an unsuccessful attempt? Also, if the person tells you, beat it, I don't want your help, would you then immediately go home, or do you let them know you're going to go sit in the waiting room for a couple of hours? in case they change their minds?
I have learned so much. Every single time I walk into one of these hospitals, I get nervous because you really never know what you're going to be dealing with. But I've learned to shake that nervousness off. The approach has to be honest and direct. Sometimes getting to that place takes letting the person talk and listening more. Also, it's super important to treat each person with respect. I call them by their full name and shake their hand. We don't realize that sometimes it's been so long since anyone was respectful or kind to these people, it can bring down the walls just offering that much. If there are family members around, I try to separate them from the conversation. Patients in this position usually never want to talk openly in front of their family members because there's obviously a lot of shame and judgment there. The last thing I've learned is to be open about my own history with them and let them know that I know how they feel. Usually, if I can get all of that into our first meeting, I don't walk away empty-handed. If they tell me they don't want help, I offer my phone number and try to get theirs. I ask the patient if it's okay if I call them and check on them to see how they're feeling. Usually they're willing to go that far. Once I have their phone number, I try to establish communication and see where it goes. Sometimes, like the example I just gave, a few months later, a person can change their mind.
So do you periodically meet up with other recovery specialists and have, workshops or support groups or anything to try to help each other deal with the stress and hopefully improve the process? Does what the recovery specialists learn feed back into training new recovery specialists at all?
Yes, we meet up every other week with other recovery specialists in my group to discuss issues or sometimes just vent about the healthcare system or whatever's bothering us. It's really necessary because this job isn't easy and knowing you're not in it alone is a relief. There's also a quarterly statewide meeting of specialists, but I haven't gone to that as it's usually during the work week and a few hours drive for me. I know I've learned a lot from the recovery specialists that came before me, and I think that's certainly improving the training process. There's so much to navigate in our healthcare system and different variables that can come up on the job that were not necessarily covered. We are constantly trying to improve our approaches.
How much does working on these on-call shifts where you reach out to people who have just had some sort of episode, if not an overdose, I imagine it would be a drug-related health emergency like a heart attack from cocaine use. How does interacting with these folks remind you how dangerous a relapse might be for you personally? If you're having a very bad day where you're feeling tempted, does seeing someone close to death act as a wake-up call? Or human perspectives can be disconnected from reality, though it could be something like the death penalty doesn't deter violent crime.
Well, that's the funny thing about people with substance use disorders. If it was simple enough to say this can kill you, and that would make us not do it, there really wouldn't be anyone using drugs in the first place, right? We don't really respond to scare tactics when it comes to cleaning up our lives. Another reason jails don't work. Unfortunately, in this type of work, and when you tend to surround yourself with other people in recovery from addiction, a lot of people are going to die around you. My aunt used to say to me, "I got news for you, kid. The older you get, the more funerals you go to." And this is true in life, but even more so when you live a life of recovery. This is a chronic, fatal disease that sometimes has relapses, just like cancer, and can go into remission and then resurface. The reality is people die from this, and I've been to a lot of funerals, but that doesn't keep me from going back to using. What keeps me from going back to using is my quality of life and the desire to keep it. When I'm having a bad day and feel tempted, it's important to remember self-care. I can't help anyone else if I'm on the verge of relapsing myself. Balance is a hard thing for most people, but especially for people with a tendency to be obsessive and compulsive. However, balance is necessary in order to maintain recovery. So if I'm personally struggling, I don't sign myself up for more shifts. I usually take a step back and refocus on myself by doing some of the things I need to do: journaling, therapy, exercise, etc.
So something I've seen commonly is that people who have been through a lot of ups and downs in their life those ups and downs tend to make them kind. Suffering seems to amplify empathy and compassion. How important to you is volunteering as a part of your recovery? Forgive me if this is an ignorant or rude question, but is there a component of just keeping yourself occupied to it? I have to imagine that a lot more entertaining hobbies out there that I would do if I was just looking to fill time and distract myself. So does giving back play a special role to you?
I'll start by saying this. If I just wanted to keep myself occupied, I would hope I could find something better to do than drive to hospitals at 2 a.m. on a Saturday to talk to someone about a drug problem. Sleeping would definitely be my first choice if given a list of options. Giving back is crucial for me and most people I know in recovery to maintain it because it keeps us humble and reminds us that there are more important things out there happening besides our own personal insignificant dramas. The idea is to really pay it forward in that many of the people that helped me along the way were not paid or doing it for any kind of benefit. They simply loved me until I could stand on my own feet, and now that I can, I need to give that to someone else. It's really that simple. Personally, I also feel like I was given a chance that hundreds of thousands of people a year are not fortunate enough to get, and I owe it to them to try to make sure I help as many people as I can because I'm 100% positive that given the opportunity, any one of them would be happy to trade with me.
I've been very lucky my entire life. My entire existence has been easy and uneventful. But you've been through a lot of upheaval in your life. You've fought and clawed your way to all the successes you have now. You've had a number of people close to you pass away, even fairly recently. I have to imagine there's a much stronger draw to return to your addictions when things in life are going badly. How do you fight it? You attend group support meetings pretty regularly, as I recall. Would you attend more often during an especially rough patch? Is there a sponsor you would call? And how do these meetings compare to the TV versions of support group meetings we've seen?
When times get hard, as they do in life, I would step up my attendance to meetings and yes, call my sponsor, but I also have an amazing support group in my life that I depend on as well. During those times, self-care becomes the main focus, and that takes many forms the longer you stay in recovery. As someone with this disease, it's important for me to do the opposite of what I think is a good idea. So if my tendency is to isolate, then I need to go out and socialize. If my desire is to sit at home and feel sorry for myself on the couch, then I need to go out and get some exercise. I try to make this a routine in my life so that I can stay ahead of my own thinking. It can be pretty exhausting, but after a while, it just becomes a normal behavior pattern.
And the media?
As far as the representation of meetings in media, I love when I see meetings on TV or in movies. Sometimes it's pretty close to the real thing, and other times it's so off the mark, but it's always entertaining to me. I know some people don't like seeing it because it can be, and sometimes is, a misrepresentation of what these fellowships are about. There have definitely been some entertaining films about addiction and recovery, and believe me, you get to watch all of them in most rehabs, if you should ever find yourself in one. There's the fun, silly Sandra Bullock rehab rom-coms and the darker 80s Michael Keaton movie about getting sober. The most honest representation of a meeting I've seen on film, though, would be closer to the documentary The Anonymous People, which I encourage anyone to watch as it gives a really good look at addiction in America today. I also want to mention as a disclaimer that while I found recovery through a 12-step fellowship, there are many other pathways to recovery. There is medicated assisted treatment we talked about. There are other groups out there like Smart Recovery that are not based in 12 steps, and there are plenty of people finding long-term recovery through other combinations of therapy and support. Oh, and by the way, if people are really curious, there are open meetings that anyone is welcome to attend, and they can check it out for themselves. All of these fellowships are worldwide and have websites to find meeting locations.
Are there any myths, confusions, or stereotypes about addiction you want to be sure to explain to all of us before we wrap things up?
I think we covered a lot of good topics and hopefully cleared up some of those myths and stereotypes about addiction that I wanted to explain. If I was able to change the perspective of one person by telling my story and about the kind of work we do, I'd consider that a win. We really do have a public health crisis on our hands. Substance use was always a problem in this country, but the record number of deaths in the last 10 to 20 years have made this an epidemic. My suggestion is to get involved because this does affect each of us, either through our pockets and taxes or through our hearts with loved ones. Everyone suffers when substance use disorders are misunderstood and mistreated. Most people know someone that struggles with this disorder or have lost a loved one to it, but most don't know that there are millions of people that have found a way out of it. The idea of once a junkie, always a junkie is not a fact, and I am living proof of that along with my friends and all the people living in recovery all over the world. I know people in recovery that are doctors, lawyers, scientists, writers, and more. Some people you know may be in recovery and you probably never even realized it. I'd ask people to open up their minds and at a minimum allow a change of perspective to realize the way we've been doing things has not made anything better. So it's time to start thinking differently about solutions.
That was very well said. You know, you're the first expert we've ever had as a guest on the show, and I think you did an amazing job. It takes a surprising amount of work to put an episode like this together, and you were a real trooper dealing with my ignorant questions with a lot of patience and experience.
And I feel like I got a bit of a vacation. It was incredibly nice to have another person with some in-depth experience on the show. I cannot thank you enough for being here today, Liz.
It was great being here. Thanks for having me, guys, and thank you so much for giving this topic some interest. It really is what I'm most passionate about.
That's all the time we have for today. These short episodes are a brief overview of very complex topics. Everything we say is for entertainment and educational purposes only. Licensed healthcare professionals should advise you and be aware of changes you're planning to make to any aspect of your healthcare. Every person's needs are different. The links to references we've made about news articles, medical studies, or other materials can be found at level989.com, along with our contact information and the complete Don't Take Medical Advice from Podcasts disclaimer. Don't forget to take a moment to rate or review us in iTunes or give us a mention on social media. We can't inform everyone if they don't know we exist. Thanks for listening, and now go health yourself.